Take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
So in the face of these tariffs and the likely economic outcomes that we're gonna probably start seeing because of it, I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, just what type of leader it seems to me Donald Trump is shaping up to be. He's been on the public stage for quite a long time now, but he's also just starting this administration. He clearly feels that he wants to do these tariffs now, either because it's going to give him more. I think it's because in whatever the fallout from this is going to be, it's going to give him more time to decide what to do next, whether he's trying to use it as a negotiation tactic of some kind, or he thinks that there's genuinely greener pastures on the other side of like the economic disaster that it's going to cause, or if he thinks that in the face of that economic disaster, he can do power grabs that he would not be able to do in a stable economy. And I think that that is, if it's not the most likely option in terms of his motivation, I do definitely think that's on his mind. And I think that when he takes himself through, to whatever extent he does, what might happen because of these tariffs, I think, you would have to like genuinely be a moron. Even in Trump's first term, there were uprisings against his policies, against the police, some of which genuinely challenged his power, at least for a moment. So the idea that there's going to be unrest because you wreck the economy has to be something that he's at least thought about or has occurred to him, because Donald Trump is not afraid to repress popular movements, to use the military to repress citizens. I think he feels like it would be fine to murder citizens and protesters if they were to challenge him to, any real extent. And so I think he's probably thought about it. And I think in his mind, people uprising over tariffs is not a concern for him, because he would just use that as an opportunity to consolidate power even further using martial law or something like that. And I really think that not only, other people have pointed out that Trump is almost certainly the most likely president to invoke martial law in some kind of dictatorial fashion, but also the fact that not just that particular move, but the overall series of events that we're seeing starting to take shape here, where the potentiality exists that things could get bad enough because of Donald Trump's economic policy that he would feel the need to invoke martial law or take the opportunity to invoke martial law. I think that is quite similar to the effect of American foreign policy all around the globe that we have seen for many decades at this point. That particular concept that if you crash somebody's economy, then you essentially make them less of a factor in terms of global politics, and you make it so that their overall there's more room for coups to happen. There's more room for somebody to be completely isolated from their trading partners and essentially disempowered, essentially using economic turmoil. And this is policy that America has done many times, not only backing dictators in places like Chile, Philippines, Nicaragua, but not only is the U.S.-backed dictator a part of that picture, but also is the economic pressure imposed by the U.S. and sanctions imposed by the U.S., as well as political games that are played to isolate those countries from their allies or the political parties in those countries from their access to power, so that more right-wing dictatorships can come into power. Over and over again, this is what America has done throughout the world, is purposely suppressed communist and socialist governments and regimes anywhere that they might start to actually take power by empowering right-wing figures. And This is at the expense of the institutions of these nations, at the expense of the currency of these nations, at the expense of the allyship of these nations, the viability of these nations, whatever it may be. America doesn't really care about anything other than other nations not challenging the flow of capital and the balance of capital throughout the world. And so what Trump is doing with these tariffs is he's very much interrupting that balance of capital throughout the world. And the one thing that doesn't quite like match the paradigm of American interference in other nations is the idea of a more powerful nation that is leaning on us. And there's speculation about, Trump being tied to Russia or being doing all of this to weaken America in favor of Russia. In other words, that a connection to Russia could be his motivation for doing that, for purposely weakening America. And I mean, I think that that's probably true. It's not really the point that I'm trying to make here because, I don't really want to get bogged down in this video about whether or not the connection between Russia exists and what exactly that looks like, what we do and don't have evidence for. I have covered that in other videos. I'm sure I will continue to. But this is more about the fact that whether Trump is sponsored by some kind of outside entity or not, whether he's just a homegrown, good old American moron, I think that what he's doing politically is very clearly a turning inward of the American policy that we have exported throughout the world for the last 100 years or more. And it's not that surprising that the political methods, the methods of political change, and the theories of repressing uprisings and repressing any type of socialist reform throughout the world is now becoming the playbook that is used in America by Americans to erode the institutions of America. And I think that the pretense of democracy has kind of separated America from the reality of a lot of its policy for quite a long time. And only now, because of Donald Trump, is the sort of mask being ripped off of that. The balance of power when it comes to America, the dynamic has really been that it kind of doesn't matter who's president, because the positioning of America globally, as opposed to other nations and the American interest, so to speak, makes it so that whatever president comes into power, they are incentivized to kind of play by the same rule book. And as long as there is a general sense of a democratic process happening in America, whatever types of politics we sponsor globally in order to protect the capital of this nation and protect the interests of this nation through whatever convoluted channels or means that might be, pretty much all presidents have been on board with that historically, and that certainly includes Trump. Even though what Trump is doing now is interrupting a lot of those relationships in a way that other presidents have not been willing or haven't found any reason to do. And so I think that this is kind of the bed that we made for ourselves. Again, regardless of if there's some kind of puppet master who wanted to sponsor a leader like Trump to do this to America, it's more likely that we are just doing this to ourselves, because despite the fact that we were maintaining and upholding a somewhat respectable democratic process, we were already on this path. Donald Trump is not single-handedly doing it, and I would say the Republican Party is pretty much internally, in terms of domestic politics, the Republican Party is the one that is responsible for turning our dictatorial style of political export onto ourselves. And the Republican Party is the one that basically said that same type of leadership that we are trusting to repress and quell communist and socialist uprisings in other countries, that is the way to lead our own country as well. And so that embracing of that style of politics has essentially taken what was at least a masquerade of a fair democratic process and eroded it into something already much more farcical than it was 20 years ago. And this is a result of the fact that our sponsorship, our supposed dedication to democracy, has really stopped at our own front door, if you could even argue that we uphold that within America, which I think there's an argument that up to a certain point we did and have, and maybe still are, we'll see. But, globally, America doesn't really give a fuck about democracy and is willing to subvert or overthrow or coup or cheat democracies in other nations in order to protect our capitalistic interests. So that's really the priority. And, it's often theorized with pretty solid backing that what happens when capitalism needs to defend itself, what happens when capitalism is ultimately going to fail, is that it needs to depend on fascism to protect its interest, to coerce the people into continuing to acquiesce to a capitalistic way of living. As capitalism robs people more and more, the rich get richer and richer, and conditions get worse and worse. The only way to maintain the political system that created those conditions, that's no longer working for people, no longer holding up its end of the deal, its end of the social contract, is to become a more repressive state and a more coercive and violent state that will force people to acquiesce to a system that's no longer working for them. And so this is where you get the marriage of capital and government that is one of the core pieces of what defines fascism. You also have religion tied in there, which is, obviously associated with the Trump movement, but that's a different topic, I think. But, essentially that's what we're seeing. We are seeing capitalism defend itself by doing away with democracy. And this is what America has sponsored around the globe. So it's not that surprising that eventually the only way for us to protect our own interests, the way of life that we have been protecting globally through, coups that were disempowering socialists and communists anywhere that they might organically come to power. Now the only way to protect that all-American way of life is to rip the mask off and do away with the democratic institutions that propped up those in power that, essentially disseminated that dictatorial leadership throughout the world. And so you get Trump defying the courts, you get Trump trying to erode our systems of elections, get Trump arguing that no federal judges should be able to stop him from doing anything. He's trying to strip people of rights like birthright citizenship and that sort of thing. He's deporting people without the permission of the law or of any court anywhere, and basically, on the logic that if they get people out of the country quick enough, there's nothing that anyone can do to bring them back. So, this is the type of policy that we are now seeing in America because we are no strangers to that type of policy. And that's what it is important for people to recognize, even still on the global stage. We are supporting dictators like that, like Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel and the Israeli project in general, of colonizing that part of the world in the interest of creating a democracy that excludes the people that are native to that land. That's our vision of the only democracy in the Middle East. That is a classic example of the type of government system that America likes to prop up globally. So really, Trump and Netanyahu being best buddies, not that Biden ever gave him very much trouble either, but it's just a ripping the mask off. Trump sees no reason to pay lip service to the idea of, American idealism and democracy and protecting of norms and people's rights at home or abroad. He just doesn't care about any of that. And, I want to make it clear that that's completely our own fault. Trump is probably, we can say he's a puppet of Putin. He's a puppet of whatever. He's a Manchurian candidate from China. Maybe he is. I don't know. I certainly think that that's what my eyes seem to be telling me when I look at him. But at the same time, this is a 100% homegrown problem, and if there is some other entity globally that's doing that to us, it's only because that's what America has been doing for all of this time. And we created that weakness by setting up the playbook and imposing the conditions on ourselves that we use to repress nations throughout the world, which is, making ourselves vulnerable to this type of takeover from a dictator rather than clawing back some of the power and capital from the wealthiest people in this nation and redistributing it so that there's a little bit more of a distribution of resources that people can participate in this country. Instead, you get something that's more and more top heavy, more and more repressive, and more dangerous for everybody. And so the last thing I want to leave you guys with here on this one is a quote from a book I'm reading. It's called Poor People's Movements by Francis Piven and Richard Cloward. And I'm not very far into this book yet, but essentially the idea behind it is that they make the argument that movements, liberation movements, strikes, poor people's movements, protests of any kind that are done by poor people, they are confined to the what those people are able to do, what conditions allow for those people to do in terms of protest at any given time, and what the conditions look like that allow for serious rebellion versus what the conditions look like that don't allow for serious rebellion, even if serious rebellion would be justified. And so let me look at this, let's look at this little excerpt from this book. But protest movements do not arise during ordinary periods. They arise when large-scale changes undermine political stability. It is this context, as we said earlier, that gives the poor hope and makes insurgency possible in the first place. It is this context that also makes political leaders somewhat vulnerable to protest by the poor. At times of rapid economic and social change, political leaders are far less free either to ignore disturbances or to employ punitive measures. At such times, the relationship of political leaders to their constituents is likely to become uncertain. This unsettled state of political affairs makes the regime far more sensitive to disturbances, for it is not only more likely that previously uninvolved groups will be activated, the scope of conflict will be widened in Schattschneider's terminology, but that the scope of conflict will be widened at a time when political alignments have already become unpredictable. So essentially what this is saying is that even though leaders in people in power are normally able to ignore protest movements because poor people tend to have so little leverage in society, it is in moments where enormous change is happening that leaders are able to ignore movements less. And the reason is because when those changes are happening and when nobody is certain what is going to happen because of it, the relationship between the leaders and the people that support them starts to change. And the demands that exist on that leader also start to change. And this happened last time Trump was in office because of COVID. There was a time where the expectation of Trump was that he do everything that he can to stop the spread of COVID and protect people. And even though he did a terrible job of doing that, there was a good few months stretch where that was the number one thing that he was being pressured to do. And it was because of the way things were changing and nobody knew what was going to happen. So these tariffs are also going to cause that. And this moment of uncertainty, the way this is going to interrupt the supply chain, even if whatever factories come here and build here, there's going to be a lot of fallout because of this. And that fallout is going to affect a lot of Trump's voters. And so it is in that moment, not just because some things are going to change, there's going to be some new policies, but we could be possibly up against a time of momentous change that could include a lot of people being pushed into poverty and a lot of volatility of our system. And in that time is when even the people that voted for Trump, possibly even some of Trump's most ardent supporters, their expectations of him are going to change. And so if there's any opportunity that we have to, communicate a message with and through those people that can actually move the country in the right direction, it is in the moment of crisis that is likely to be caused by his tariffs. In other words, now is the time to agitate for Medicare for all, for universal basic income, and for policies like that, expansion of Medicaid and Social Security, because the instability that's going to be caused by Trump's policies is potentially the pretense for those demands to become more pertinent.